games are done!
Okay, I love Pokemon as much as the next gal, but I have the same relationship to time in Pokemon as a Palworld YouTuber has to Palworld, in that I don't really have strong opinions on it, but I do have very strong opinions on something only tangentially related, and I want to spite people who disagree with me. But that's a bad way to live your life, so by writing the script, I hope to grow a better appreciation for this very relevant aspect of Pokemon games and become the Diamond Clan's strongest soldier. I always liked Dialga more than Palkia anyway. For this video, I will be discussing how longer and longer units of time affect Pokemon games. I will be starting with milliseconds, as while I considered starting with the Planck time, I couldn't think of anything important that happens on that scale. Suck it, quantum physicists. What even is quantum physics, anyway? Unfortunately, Pokemon doesn't involve discussions of subatomic particles, so we're stuck with milliseconds. So without further ado, let's get into the second lighthearted talk from Lightheart the Second. Hey, what does ado mean? Whatever. But what happens in Pokemon on the scale of milliseconds? More than you would think. You see, computer screens don't actually produce constant light. They actually flicker on and off. The Nintendo Switch does this at a rate of about 60 Hz. This has no in-battle applications. I just think it's really cool. It's been said that this is a bit slow, meaning the console can cause eye strain in some. This is also the case with the 3DS, so maybe that's just all Nintendo consoles. Am I going to Google it? Yes, I did, and yes, they are. Although there is some slight variance between consoles. However, there is something actually relevant to gameplay that I would like to talk about, and that is RNG manipulation. Yes, I have to talk about this again. The issue is that RNG manipulation methods differ wildly between games, so I've never actually bothered to learn any. If you want guides to RNG manipulation, consider the YouTube channel I'm a Blissey. But I know enough about it to say that timing seems to be quite important in a lot of cases. As often RNG is seeded based on the device's internal clock, this often requires split-second accuracy, and the more I learn about it, the more I respect speedrunners who waste their lives on this absurdity. I will learn about RNG manipulation when they break in battle RNG, which I acknowledge is a much more daunting task for many complicated reasons. Next up is seconds, and there's so many things to talk about. It takes seconds to pick up an item, it takes seconds to save the game, it takes seconds for you to meet a shiny, and it takes seconds for a critical hit to destroy your chances. They're the poetic backbone of Pokemon and can make or break your experience. Often break with how slow those Gen 4 games run, Jesus Christ. But I'm not here for poetry. What about seconds affects gameplay? One aspect is in my favorite game, Pokemon Legends Arceus. PKLA has non-turn-based boss battles. They are pretty easy. However, when I first got the game, it was only the second Switch game I'd ever owned, and only the fourth I'd ever played. The only Switch game I'd actually played consistently was Brilliant Diamond, and the only non-strategy game I'd ever played consistently on a console was Mario Kart for the DS. So I got solidly destroyed even by Hisuian Arcanine. This forced me to practice and get better at something outside my comfort zone. But now that I practice a bit, I can pretty consistently beat them without even sending a Pokemon out. This means that to effectively do some Pokemon challenges, you need to learn some unrelated skills. I mean, that was always the case since the game is literally built with math, and you need some understanding of how math works to win. But this is a different skill entirely. A similar thing was done in the Hoenn games with the Braille Golems. Unless you're like me and cheated with Google. Anyway, not to say these battles aren't really easy for people well practiced in Nintendo Switch combat, I'm just not one of them. I'm much more of a turn-based strategy player. I've wanted to get into some real-time strategy games for a while though, so if you have any recommendations, something comment section. What also happens on the scale of seconds is the simpler turn combos, which are very important in and of themselves. The most obvious to anyone who has ever watched a Nuzlocke video is pivoting. Basically, how it works is, imagine you have a Gyarados and your AI opponent has an Emolga. You are going to be hit with an electric type move here. Your Floatzel can outspeed but can't take a Thunderbolt from the Emolga. However, if you switch to your Mudsdale, Emolga will fail a Thunderbolt and is forced to use Acrobatics next turn, which Floatzel can survive. You might be thinking, Lightheart, that's an incredibly specific situation. Have you considered coming up with an example of pivoting off the top of your head is really hard, but the principles behind pivoting become so much more complicated when you get into competitive. Basically, the Pokemon AI is way easier to predict than a real player. Real people actually switch out for one. This leads to the concept of double switching, in which you switch in a Pokemon while you expect your opponent to switch. So let's say you're playing Gen 1 OU and you just killed the other Pokemon with Explosion. You sended Rhydon as they sended Zapdos. Zapdos can't really do much to Rhydon and just dies to Rock Slide. So it's likely they will switch here, and the perfect choice is Starmie, whose Surf is kind of scary, not gonna lie. While you could just hit with Rock Slide, they will probably just recover it off, so hear me out. It might be an idea to predict them and switch to Jolteon to keep the advantageous position. Now, if you're very clever, you might be thinking, hey wait a minute, nothing's changed. You just traded an advantageous position for an advantageous position. Well yes, but actually no. You see, what you did, assuming your prediction was correct, was trade one advantage for a different, better advantage. For example, if your opponent's team consists of Reflectlax, Tauros, Alakazam, and Starmie, it is probably harder to switch into Jolteon than it is to Rhydon. Why you didn't just switch in Jolteon to begin with is beyond me, but whatever, hypotheticals are hard, and you get the principle. This allows for a multiple turn combo which increases your damage relative to your opponent's damage. Honestly, it's fine that a lot more casual players struggle with this IMO. I mean, I struggle with this. But you know what is personally offensive to me? Nobody understands status moves. This is going to be the death of me. A lot of more casual players seem to think they're weak. What? You know what? Forget the slightly less intuitive stuff like Growl and Lair. Some people think Encore is useless. I mean, you can literally switch into a move you're immune to, then outspeed and Encore your opponent into that attack, making you completely immune to all of that Pokemon's attacks. You know what? If you're one of these people, I have some homework for you. During your next playthrough, for every single one of your Pokemon, have at least one status move in their moveset. For more examples, you can use Thunder Wave while slower to attack at the same rate, since after Thunder Wave you'll be faster, along with the chance for them to get fully paralyzed, basically giving you a turn advantage. Honestly, all status moves could be included in this, but that's a whole video in and of itself. I will, however, mention that if you're 2-hit KOing anyway, and not getting 1-hit KO, it is objectively in your best interest to use Swords Dance or Nasty Plot. If you are being 1-hit KO'd, however, I don't recommend that. Although, I don't recommend being 1-hit KO'd generally. Oh, and obviously single moves also take a few seconds, but what am I supposed to say here? Don't get hit by super effective moves and hit your opponent with them? I hope you already knew that. It's implied by the term super, meaning to a great extent, and effective, meaning to have an effect. But you already knew that unless this is your first time hearing about Pokemon, in which case, hi, you must be very confused. But assuming you speak English, you probably know what super effective means. Unless, of course, you don't speak English, or can't hear, in which case, these videos probably have no entertainment value, and I recommend doing something more fun, like playing Pokemon. Next up is minutes. What happens during minutes in Pokemon? Well, the day-night cycle in some games, but it's probably best to leave that to the hours section. What really happens are the actually fun battles. Whether it be player vs player, which takes a lot more brain power by default, or a tough gym battle, or a mistake that sends you running to the damage calculator, or on a Google search to learn what idiotic mechanic Gen 2 invented this time, that last one requires a good understanding of how to find information in Pokemon. Let's discuss the main information sources you could use to speed up this process so that it takes fewer minutes for you to find said info. First things first, if you want to use the damage calculator easily while playing online, I recommend the Showdex extension. This acts as a damage calculator within the Showdown client and automatically records the moves and items your opponent has, although you can change the set you predict your opponent is using at will. This is especially useful in Generations 1 and 2, where you don't have to guess your opponent's EVs and items, either because they don't exist, or the answer is leftovers. Frankly, if Shedinja was in Generation 2, it would probably run leftovers just to fit in. Some people call it cheating, I call it efficient. Get it now if you haven't already. Unless they ever ban it, in which case don't break any rules. But it's also important to run calcs outside of battle, which is what the official Showdown calculator is for. It is designed for competitive play, so it has a bunch of sets for the opposing Pokemon, but what if you're not playing competitive? competitive? Well, if it's Gen 1 or 2, you should just throw it out and do the math yourself, since it assumes maxed stat EXP and the opposing trainers have none. But even for Gen 3 Plus, you're going to need some assistance, and that comes in the form of trainer docs. Most trainer docs can be found in a channel in Flagon HD's Discord server or something. However, it is worth noting that the kind of trainer docs you need will be different in different generations. For example, in Generation 3 onward, it's better to use a style that has level, IVs, nature, and EVs, whereas in Generations 1 and 2 you just want the raw stats. This is because the Showdown calculator automatically calculates the stats you should have based on those, whereas doing the math by hand requires actually knowing your opponent's stats. Here's the damage formula, by the way. Remember to do truncated integer division, or don't bother with all this math nerd stuff. It's also important to note that most games don't have opposing trainers with fancy EVs and natures and stuff, with stuff like Sun and Moon and BDSP being the exception, not the rule. Anyway, link to a post by Sadistic Mystic with raw stats of Generation 1 and 2 Pokemon, since those can be quite hard to find. But if you're not trying to do math and still want to win at Pokemon, you're going to need a wiki. And I have just the suggestion. Bulbapedia. It's the best Pokemon wiki. I use it for everything. Honestly, if you want a fact, there is a 95% chance it is there. I know I was mean to them in my first video, and yeah, occasionally there are some mistakes and all, but it's mostly a very good site. 10 out of 10, I cannot recommend having at least 10 Bulbapedia tabs open at any time enough. Honestly, the optimal search history is just 100 million Bulbapedia tabs and the odd YouTube video. Unfortunately, I watch too much YouTube, so I'm a little out of whack on that one. It has all the information you need, not to mention the stuff you don't. For example, did you know that, quote, Finneon is a small fish-like Pokemon with an ellipsoid body. The bottom half of its body is a light blue, while the top half is black. A pink stripe runs across either side of Finneon's horizontal wing. It has small pectoral fins, 2 black oval-shaped dorsal fins, and pink eyes. Finneon's most notable feature is a pair of corkidal fins that resemble a pair of blue butterfly wings with pink spots. The bottom lobe of a female Finneon's tail are bigger than the male's. Finneon's pink stripes and spots can absorb sunlight, which allows those areas to shine vividly at night. Finneon shines itself as a form of camouflage, as well as to attract prey. Because I didn't, and I didn't need to. It's like if the Pokédex was accurate. But let's say you need information so niche that Bulbapedia doesn't have it. There are 3 options. First up, Cerebi. This suffers from a major problem, being ugly. However, it does have a lot of really nice features. For example, they have the teams of the entire Elite Four laid out on one page as opposed to Bulbapedia, which has them on different pages. They also have this really convenient thing in their attack decks, where the abilities a Pokemon has are displayed alongside that Pokemon's base stats. Although, you know who also has this info and doesn't look terrible? Smogon. This one is mostly for competitive, but it does have a list of what Pokemon know what moves, in what generation, and that is very useful to me. Mostly because it is less ugly than Cerebi. But you know what? That's something. And if I ever get super into competitive, I know where to go. Last but not least is Pokemon DB. I haven't used this much, but it seems competent. Good for when Bulbapedia is down anyway. Less info, but meh. Oh, and a dishonorable mention to the fandom wiki. It is ugly, inaccurate, vague, generally garbage, and run by idiots. Wait, what was I talking about? Not wasting minutes of your life? Nope, the exact opposite actually. Well, I was mentioning how the most epic battles in Pokemon often take several minutes to complete, but the tactics that make those battles will only take a few turns. And explaining the entire spectrum of those battles and the strategies within is hard. So let's talk about boring tactics which take forever. One great example of this is switching back and forth with immunities. For example, if your opponent only knows Fire and Psychic type moves and you can't get a Flash Fire Houndour or a Terra Dark Flash Fire Pokemon, you can switch between a Dark type Pokemon and a Pokemon with Flash Fire for like 50 turns to stall out all their moves and force them to struggle. This is because the AI will not use a Psychic type move against a Dark type, nor a Fire type move against a Pokemon it knows has Flash Fire. With the ability ability Flash Fire being revealed when hit with the Fire-type move that the Dark-type baits. You can repeat this until your opponent runs out of moves and struggles to death. Also, did you know you can set up on any Pokemon with a 2-turn move like Solar Beam? Okay, so turn 0, you bait the Solar Beam and get hit. Turn 1, you Encore them into Solar Beam. Turn 2, you protect. Turn 3, you use any move you want. It's a free turn, they have to set up Solar Beam. Their Encore will end here, but since they are locked into Solar Beam, on turn 4 you protect to avoid the Solar Beam, and then Encore them again. Rinse, repeat for as long as you want. You do need the modern 3-turn Encores and not the old chance-based ones, but the point is there are more potential weaknesses in an opponent's team if you're willing to sit through a long battle to exploit them. In fact, the strategy is so much fun, I've actually tricked a Leper Berry onto my opponent to set up even more. Also, one Pokemon that is incredible for stupidly long setups is Cloyster. This is because they can do 2 things. 1, set up hazards very easily against physical attackers, and 2, set up Shell Smash very easily against physical attackers. I've personally run 2 Cloyster sets in a Scarlet and Violet playthrough which embody this. Iron Defense, Shell Smash, Rest, Terra Blast, and Iron Defense, Spikes / Poison Jab, Toxic Spikes, and Rest. First you set up 3 Iron Defenses, then rest up to full health, then either set 3 Spikes and 2 Toxic Spikes, 3 Shell Smashes, and 2 more Iron Defenses, or just 2 Toxic Spikes. And then finally, either sweep with Terra Blast or whatever move you're using, or spam Poison Jab. You see, Poison Jab has a 30% chance to poison, so the chances you get at least 1 with your +6 defense is very high. You can even run the Spikes Cloyster and then the Shell Smash Cloyster if there's no Dupes clause. Obviously you can only do this fancy setup against a physical attacker. If you're feeling really mean, you can even use something like Charm to lower their attack stat. And that's just one Shell Armor trick I can think of. Also, general PowerPoint stalling also falls under this. For a great target for PP stalling, look no further than Juan's Kingdra. On my first playthrough of Emerald a few months back, I really struggled against this man. Mostly because I didn't want to use a level 70 Rayquaza, and I like using a full team of 6, which means I end up really underleveled in pre-Gen 6 games. The issue was that because Struggle Recoil does far less in Generation 3 than in modern games, even though I could run them out of PP with my pretty bulky team, I would get swept anyway. The solution ended up being stalling them out of PP on their attacking moves, then sending in Impossifly, my Beautifly, and using Aerial Ace to take the win. Butterfree is still my preferred Butterfly Pokemon, but honestly solid performance. It's worth noting that this was made far easier thanks to the existence of the HM for Dive, which is a pretty garbage move generally in this generation. It allows you to basically protect twice in a row, as you get the Protect turn of immunity, and then the Dive turn of immunity. Point is, don't underestimate HMs. They suck in every way, but at least you can use them infinitely in games without infinite TMs. Unrelated, but why did they remove infinite TMs? Fake video game, 0 out of 10. At least they removed a bunch of other grinding to make up for it, I guess. Not to mention you can at least get infinite single-use TMs in Scarlet and Violet. But point is, sometimes tactics take a while. This is also the case in competitive, although in a different way. A lot of the time the goal is to threaten a complex tactic to force someone out, instead of actually playing it out. This is where Porygon's niche in Generation 1 comes from. Yes, it can stall out Reflectlax because it's immune to Body Slam paralysis and learns Recover, which is more PP than Body Slam. I know that, and you know that. But your opponent isn't going to be stupid enough to throw out one of their best Pokemon to beat a Porygon. You're just informing them that you're willing to have them do so. Unless you put them in a position where they can't switch out, of course. In which case, good on you, you're great at this game, have a cookie. Unless it's actually Amnesia Lax, in which case, Lamau get good. This also applies to a lesser extent to Reflect Chansey, but that one's a little shakier due to Soft-Boiled having less PP, and the fact that you can't also run a different Chansey set. Oh, and obviously Reflectlax struggles to break Reflectlax, but a Reflectlax for Reflectlax trade seems pretty fair, IMO. Reflectlax doesn't sound like a real word anymore. Although it never was, and it doesn't crumble to Amnesia Lax, unlike some people. Anyway, PP stalling in competitive is very different. Anyway, PP stalling in competitive is a very different war from PP stalling AI, because your opponent can switch. So basically, you have to wall every living member of your opponent's team, which is no easy task. Since all great walls can be broken, you need someone who can wall the wall breakers of your other walls. goals. For example, if you have a Blissey, you need someone who can tank the close combats being thrown in its direction by unhappy opponents. Toxapex is great for this, but Toxapex prefers to avoid being the recipient of ground, electric, or psychic type moves. Skarmory, however, loves dodging ground type moves and can live a psychic attack if needed, but again, weak to electric. It would be a shame if no physical electric moves existed, allowing Blissey to destroy them. Although honestly, the differences between physical and special attacks of different types could also be its own video. But point is, if you're running stall, you need to be able to stall a lot. This means balancing switching for better matchups with healing. Pokemon with Regenerator like Toxapex and Amoonguss are highly effective for this. Although it's worth noting that PP stalling isn't the only way to stall, as since their goal is to extend the game, setting hazards is often highly effective as more switches equals more hazard damage. Although hazards are even stronger for the offensive Pokemon trying to break stall teams, as less HP equals more die. Point is, consider both hazards and hazard removal. I know, baby's first competitive Pokemon take. Also, don't forget that slowing the game down isn't just good for stall teams, as shown by Quagsire, who is one of the few Pokemon of staring down Zacian Crowned in Generation 8 Anything Goes. What, did Game Freak forget to give them Leaf Blade or something? Boo-hoo. Get earthquaked. Woo boy, that was a long section. Next up is Hours. Only the stupidest of Pokemon battles last this long, so let's not. What should be talked about, however, is the day-night cycle. This annoying little gimmick from Generation 2 adds a lot to the life of the game. This allows for another dimension to Nuzlocke encounter tables, as the Pokemon you can encounter at different times often differ greatly. The game that was the most creative with this was Pokemon Moon, which actually reversed the time, which is a cool little detail. Not to mention, you can get the same effect by traveling through the Altar of the Sun in Pokemon Sun. Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet actually made the time change in-game, but Arceus actually allows you to sleep to speed it up, making it by far superior in this category. Berries also take several hours to grow. Actually, can growing berries be considered a regional gimmick when it can be done in like half of the games? Honestly, shout out to Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal for leaving in a feature that allows you to change the time and reset all berry trees. That was very funny. One of the few things Heart Gold, Soul Silver made worse. Honestly, X and Y did berry growing best, keeping all the trees in one place and such. Honestly, who needs Animal Crossing when I can grow 300 citrus berries instead of buying potions? The fact that Generation 3 made it so that you can plant whatever berries you want instead of just having to get the default for that spot was also an amazing change. That way, instead of getting one berry a day, meaning your berry count grows linearly, you can plant everything you grow, meaning your berry count grows somewhat exponentially. Obviously, there's a limit to the amount you can plant, but still. If you really tried, you could realistically become the Technoblade of citrus berries. There are, however, a few worse versions of this mechanic too. Apricorn trees and honey trees. Terrible. Apricorn balls don't even work in Generation 2 and mostly suck in Gen 4, and I'd rather just buy them. Honey trees are a different beast entirely. I've never had to seek out a honey tree exclusive, and every day I dread the day I will. Getting Pokemon from trees was perfected with Headbutt, and yet they somehow made the physically worst possible version of this mechanic. You see, in Sinnoh, there are like 2 trees in the entire region which can have a 1% chance of having a Munchlax, and every day you can slather it with honey to roll for a 1% encounter Munchlax. The worst part? The trees are random. Have fun, or don't. This is the worst region, and I'm not sorry. I would rather full-on shiny hunt. I would rather not play Pokemon. I would rather lie to my best friend. I would rather destroy the entire world than scratch my finger on the sharp edge of a DS while searching for this stupid baby cat. And no, I'm not done with this rant, but it's time for an intermission. What happens during the course of days in Pokemon? Playthroughs. What can I say about these? Everything. The issue is, there's no point. I'd have to explain every bit of Pokemon knowledge I have, and I would never finish that task. If you're not familiar with the concept, pick up a Pokemon game and play it till the credits roll. I can only promise to put my heart and soul into every single what I do and explain by example. Also, some things are based on the days of the week, but honestly they all suck and are inconvenient. 0 out of 10 worst edition ever, who cares what day it is? If I wanted to remember that, I would become a uni student. Wait. But what about weeks, months, years? You may be thinking. True. But first I would like to talk about something else. Turns as a unit of time. Honestly, this could be its own video. Watch the Full Swipe Gaming video of why turns are everything. Although I do have something to add. bad. I would like to say that turns function in kind of a missing tile way. Turns, when played well, can blend together as a perfect strategy. It kind of makes me wish we had a term for a unit of time longer than one turn. A mega turn? No, that implies way too many. Deca turn for like 10? I don't know. The difference is in part that we can detect exactly where this beautiful pattern shatters. So accuracy that would be absurd in real life measurements is incredibly necessary. Like if you misclick and recover instead of taking the knockout with Surf, that's the turn where your strategy fails. Whereas it doesn't particularly matter which millimeter a runner overtakes another runner at the halfway point. I guess this is the difference between analog and digital measurements. You see, if you measure someone's position on a ruler, you can always get more accurate, down to the Planck length, at which point quantum physics I don't know kicks in. But with digital measurements, there is a smallest length you can measure. You can't have halves in an integer, no matter what your integer represents. If your integer represents half of a value, then you can't have half of those. If I make a space and Pokemon video, we will talk a lot more about this. But anyway, turns are an incredibly useful currency, as you basically have no choice to spend them to stay in the game. Basically like real currency. Capitalism sucks. So the goal is, if possible, to spend a turn to get a free turn and some other benefit. Again, regenerator Pokemon are great at this, healing and potentially forcing your opponent out. Although, it's worth noting that the term free turn is kind of a misnomer. Unless your opponent is dumb enough to use Hyper Beam and have to recharge, they're going to at least do something. So what you need to do is to make sure that something isn't of value to anyone. No point setting up Swordstart's Pinsir if you can't even hit Gengar. Really, a distinction you have to draw is forcing a switch and getting a free turn. Unless, of course, you can predict their switch, in which case, I guess it's a free turn again. You have a free turn with Pinsir if your opponent's Gengar is dead. Otherwise, you have a forced switch. Or not even that if your opponent's current Pokemon can stay in, knowing that even if you do Swords Dance, they can switch to Gengar next turn. Point is, don't be dumb. That's why I play single player. Your opponent rarely switches. In this case, you can get not just one, but nearly infinite free turns if you can out-heal your opponent's damage, which leads to some really funny setup. It's like Shadow Tag, but for free.